Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, following a really interesting and well-received talk that you gave at the University of Warwick during your last visit to the UK. Maybe you could just start by telling us, where you're based and what your main kind of research interests are.
All right. First of all, thanks for having me here. And it was wonderful, definitely visiting campus and meeting what was a very motivated bunch of students, PhD scholars, and faculty. I am Deepanshu Mohan. I'm based in India at the OP Jindal Global University, where I am engaged in teaching courses on economics, more narrowly on areas of development economics, but I also do some teaching around introduction to courses like political economy of development. My own work intersects areas of urban informality, what would be seen as now comparative political economy of post-reform nation states, more narrowly focused on South Asia, but I also do a lot of research in Southeast Asia. That's Cambodia, a country which is based closer to Thailand, where a lot of our work is positioned. Most of the research looks at the context of low-income migrant workers, how or under conditions of how they work, the nature of precarity or livelihood challenges they face based a result on shocks that might happen as a result of due to climate change or otherwise due to economic factors or reasons. So we have been looking at a number of projects where our work within or with focus on low-income migrant workers have looked at questions of um, access to public goods, the challenges faced in access to healthcare, education for communities. But more importantly, what I've been doing is trying to understand coping mechanisms of resilience, how communities find ways to cooperate under environments of crises or shocks to mitigate those. And a lot of this is done and studied under the informal community lens of solidarity networks, social participation, which is based through ethnographic methods of research, very much participatory to observation.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you were presenting a book that you've recently published on this research when you came to Warwick. Could you maybe say a little bit about that book for those that weren't able to join us at the event?
Yeah, so we have now what is a text in methodological insights to the practice of visual ethnography. It's a text which is put together roughly around 8 to 9 case studies where we use tools of visual documentation, largely through photography and simultaneously through videographic means to examine and study the identity and lived experiences of marginalized communities. Mostly, a lot of the work was undertaken in terms of its field research during the pandemic and the period thereafter to study the impact of the restrictions imposed during the pandemic or the crises or the nature of crises that are experienced by vulnerable communities. Our case studies are mostly positioned in a regional sense within South Asia, and the work that I presented during my talk at Warwick also was positioned through those case studies itself. So this is a book coming out in fact, end of February 2026, which is the current February 2026. The text is being published by Palgrave, MacMillan, and yeah. So, if there's anything more we could discuss that.
I was really interested in the way that you described the methodology itself, and you mentioned ethnographic methods, but then this is particularly visual ethnography. So if you could tell us a bit about how you came to choose visual ethnography as the way to do this kind of work, working on precarious communities.
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, thank you for that question. So my training is pretty much not in a classical sense in ethnographic methods. I came or arrived at using ethnography or a way of doing ethnography to understand how through fieldwork you could observe communities for longer periods of time. The communities we were planning to study in different areas, whether it was mostly in urban spaces, how do they get along from the morning routine to the evening routine and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and then just see to what extent and how questions around mitigating day-to-day challenges around livelihood or access to safer transport or work conditions, those things can be studied. And ethnography was the way in which we could find that. The use of visual ethnography came, as I said, during the pandemic to study the impact or was deemed or defined as the informal workforce. A lot of the mainstream policy attention in terms of response for the state at large was directed towards what could be done to ensure direct, let's say, through fiscal transfers or whatever measures could be done to much of the organized formal networks. But the plight of the informal communities or those unorganized or unregistered was not that visible. To visualize that, we started using photography. Photo essays were used as first ways to really show the impact of the lockdown and the pandemic, which was far more than just the healthcare impact of things. A lot of the low-income migrant communities lost their homes. They couldn't stay in the urban, in some cases, slum networks, but also in urban settlements, which had access to rent for the ways in which they would get access to other utilities of day-to-day access to water and electricity. And explain that through the case study of one of the regional examples of Kapashera, a small settlement close to Delhi and Gurgaon, how more than 500,000 people stay there. And for an average person living in Kapashera or the area, rent is not about just access to housing or affordable housing, but it's also about access to other interconnected utilities. So we documented the life of individuals and community group based individuals in particular areas by knowing through direct questions what and how their experience was. That's where videography became more important. We documented through interviews what were their day-to-day challenges. We could also get, in many cases, a lot of women to speak more freely because we found that in certain areas, women were more vocal about the nature of challenges they were facing. At the same time, there are locations or areas where we could not get access to in a reasonably more conservative setting, access to women to speak. This is through our work in Kashmir. So what visual ethnography has done is to complement, in a sincere sense, the impact of crisis shocks by bringing out insights that through a visual sense give you its own narrative. Like photo essays and the use of photographs for a lot of people became different, uh, had different interpretative meanings of what was happening on the ground. And it also generated for us a lot of attention to give or get the state or civil society's attention to those issues. So a lot of our work through visual ethnography was being published in popular media platforms like The Wire or Scroll. Digital platforms were using. Each of our case studies were published as a dissemination point through popular mediums. And what it did was it created a huge sensitization wave of understanding real impact and the policy implications. It's in fact for those reasons that the government, when it experienced a larger wave of a worse healthcare impact of the pandemic, they could not go back and announce a sort of a blatant curfew or a lockdown, shutting people out, because they just saw the impact through the visuals, which were very easy to document at the time. But it was just challenging for a logistical reason. And so we started seeing how this could emerge as a method of its own kind. Visual ethnography is one of the ways in which ethnography is done. We use tools, but in some cases we have to also be sensitive to how those tools are being brought, at what stage you're bringing a camera, or at what stage are you bringing a camera into the conversation you're having. So I also, as I spoke in my talk, the documentation of videography for example, in terms of interviews, would be done at a much later stage of a field project. It would not be done at a very initial stage. So we looked at through the cases of shorthand ethnographic work. I use the word shorthand ethnographic work for the audience to sort of understand. Ethnography could be about studying a community for years in an anthropological sense. We didn't have that much time, so we created through our case study a 6 to 8 week window to document what would be seen as the plight of that particular community in question. There was a whole team involved in this process. In many cases, ethnographic work could happen individually or in a more singular sense. And here our focus was in a more collective manner involving students, a photojournalist who was accompanying me on the field. And so we had a team of at least 4 to 5 people involved in each study that we were doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If it's all right to jump in with another question. It sounds to me like you were bringing together quite varied, multiple data sources in your research through the application of this method. It would be wonderful to hear a little bit about how you approach that from an analysis point of view. So how you would bring those sources together, how the visual ethnography would fit for you in terms of your analysis and generating findings that you want to share with the academic community, as well as the wider network of non-academic partners that you work with.
Yeah, so I mean that's a very important question from the perspective of looking at how the increasing use of mixed methods is becoming now a powerful way of doing what otherwise in development studies you call as evidence-based policy analysis, or studying the impact of existing policies. There has been a degree of methodological individualism that economics as a discipline definitely has suffered from, and it has missed in many cases of studies of poverty to inequality. A lot of the emphasis has been on existing certain core methods. I think what we have been trying to do is to collect our own data. Each and every ethnographic study that we mention of, in fact, in the book as well, has involved primary data collection of over 100 respondents. So this is in a traditional sense, not had interviews, which is less than 100, because a lot of the information we were collecting was also looking at things around income, household consumption patterns, debt, things which were affecting the daily lives of people in that sense. So you needed a representative sample to get a sense of what the actual situation was. And in our context, the sort of complementarity of that primary data would be then pegged with a larger let's say macro picture, where as is my training as an economist, I do look at questions around household debt and where and how household debt has become a concern in the post-pandemic context for many developing societies. The interest on debt burdens are making now, including for communities which have access to more credit, or even in cases where you don't have access to credit, there's a huge cost of debt servicing, which is affecting household consumption choices. So what we have been doing, or what we were doing in the context of our work, was using the micro sort of or more granular data collected through primary data collection means, and using, of course, ethnographic methods to collect data through a representative sampling of having enough women in a set, male respondents, having a very good sense of social identity-based markers. Caste is a big concern and question, because in social hierarchy, as you do in the northeast of India, where there's ethnicity which plays a lot more of an important role, in much of the North Indian case studies, caste has a very important factor in terms of how access to resources are defined. So we made sure that when we were actually collecting any primary data, there was enough of a sample representation of interviews through each of these cases. So the other thing was to also relate whether if there was an existing study which had happened. So for example, I gave an example of this regional settlement called Kapashera, where more than 500,000 people live. They have access to one of the most large export industrial hubs in Delhi. A lot of people work there. And what we were trying to understand was whether there was any study that had happened or done any documentation of people living in Kapashir. And we couldn't initially find anything because the state actually has not remarkably mentioned this as a key area within its geography for ensuring access to basic amenities. So I think there is the absence of data present from state organized means creates a intervention to do a lot more of ethnographic primary skill work. And in fact, our intervening point for the kind of case studies we were looking at was wherever we had not found much of documented work on a particular community, we were finding those communities to be a major, let's say in a ranked sense, they were the preferred group to start working with. And then look at basically other studies which had done any work as a reference point. But in most cases, state availability of data has been a big problem in the informal economy, as most of us know. The informal economy act in some cases of proxies. There are proxy indicators that are used, but in at least in the majority of development economics, this is a big concern, that the lack or accessibility of data, and it's flagged as a challenge as well. But what you want to look at is when you use primary data collection, I think one of the big challenge is to get a representative sample. So initially, when our sample size was less than 50, we felt that it was not giving a sort of a holistic picture. So we would go back and collect additional sample sets, and it changes a lot of your observations as well. So the academic work of data collection would have its own meaning, and we would stick to that as a sort of part of the traditional academic process. Where the visual element came very important was that some of the interviews or conversations done in a sort of an interpersonal sense gave us interesting anecdotal insights as well. And that for us became very important to document in the visual sense, for what we would want to do through a videographic interview. There's an individual, for example, someone who's 60 years old, has given a lot of historical information about the area that we have worked in. And that would become for us an important way of studying how we would look at, their perspective in understanding the history of that area. So it is in those regards that I think somewhere the accessibility of looking at a particular region or a particular area or a community was identified. The absence of any existing state figure would make us more convinced that, we do want to study this group and this area.
Thank you for that. Just building off your really helpful explanation there of some of the complexities and the nuances around both data gaps and data sources and how you bring them together. You mentioned, of course, some elements around ethnicity, identity, geography. Are there any particular considerations when applying a visual ethnography to take into consideration in terms of the positionality of the research team? Are there additional sensitivities beyond, say, employing other methods to study the subject matter?
So I would probably say one of the big challenges with using visual tools is to establish a heightened degree of trust with the community and your respondents. And I think that is one of the big challenges. I think it's generally a challenge within ethnographic work itself. Like when you're spending a lot more time with a group, you generate a lot more trust. There is a lot more of back and forth of being able to ask questions which may not strictly be fitting into the main meat of your questionnaire, and you have that flexibility. I can give examples around questions of intra-household gendered relations between male and female respondents. You don't get into the nature of those conversations at the very initial stage of the field work. And what we realized was that we started looking at the fact that in some cases where people were generally more vocal about the nature of issues they were facing in terms of their day-to-day challenges, or they were looking, for example, to blame the government or the state. I mean, this is right at the heat of the pandemic at large, where relief efforts were not really reaching. So people wanted to utilize a platform. They needed a platform. And actually, a lot of times, the visual ethnographic mechanism or as a tool allows that platform to be available, right? Using videography helps them articulate what they feel. And so in that case, you don't really need the establishment of heightened or great amount of trust. The challenge there is about validation of what is being said and to what extent is actually, coming from rage or angst or resentment versus to what extent is a part of the actual lived experience of the community at large. So you do want to not talk to, let's say, a few people, but a lot more to get a sense of how this is really more realizable. But I think one of the things which has become very critical in the way we have been using or adopting the tool and method is to utilize what are seen as, in our methodological sense, the first 3 to 4 weeks, generating a lot of interaction, a lot of communication with identified, community-based networks or respondents who you want to engage more. In that case, we want to talk to a lot of the female respondents, male respondents, and then see and establish what degree of comfort they have to be able to articulate the same things they're saying, let's say, when tools are being used. So one big area in the regional sense where we have found it to be very difficult to use visual methods have been in conflict affected areas, like Kashmir is, for example, an area where we found it very difficult to introduce or have any, use of visual tools brought in, particularly at the initial stages of any field work. So our recent work with, let's say, two communities which have been part of a minority-based network, the Tibetan Muslims based in Srinagar, or the Pashto community staying in remote areas of Kashmir, we have not been able to, document a lot of what they were able to communicate. Also, one of the things you have to be very careful and cautious about is what is being said in terms of your actual academic exercise of interviewing and documenting versus what would be coming out in a visual sense. There is a convergence of that which is very critical to our exercise, at least to our exercise. I mean, even in editing of videos, we have kept in mind that it follows a certain larger common converging story, which is very critical to the larger aspect of what the community faces, because it could be one person that you hear, right? And it could be their story, but to what extent their story resonates with the larger community at large becomes sometimes important. So videography, I think we have introduced always at the later or tail end of our fieldwork time period. I think photo essays have had a very different meaning, because a lot of times photo essays are used for landscaping purposes. By landscaping, I mean is the area, or the field area, the geographical area that we are covering. We just want people, who the viewer, to know and see what they're observing about a particular area, and in what context do people live. Like, I can give you an example, again, going back to one of the cases of Kapashir I was mentioning. Housing is a big area that we want to document. So our photo essays did a lot of coverage around what would be seen as the housing situation for people in that vicinity and space. So very interestingly, you have people who are living, and if you can see the images, and as I was showing in the talk as well, there were certain images which will tell you that people paying for less than what would be 2,000 rupees could find a house to stay in, and you could have people staying with over 20,000 rupees as rent as well. And it's all in the same community at large. So when you look at the images of how people are like cohabitating, despite having that clear sense of income and wealth inequality, how that communal form of living has been able to coexist. So I think that's where the medium or the powerful sort of space of visual documentation has, I think, helped in complementing what would otherwise be documented or written about in a traditional ethnographic academic exercise.
Thank you so much for that. And just, I guess, on a final note, and then you can add any additional things you want. I'm also curious to hear a bit more about some of the main challenges that, the research team had in sort of navigating, all of these different complexities that you're talking about, and how the perhaps the method or the practice of doing the research evolved to respond to those things as you went through. I think those would be really interesting insights to hear about the methodology. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, just to reiterate, you're looking at the challenges faced, right? Like that's what you're probably trying to ask again. Is that so, Maisen?
Yes, please. Just
The
some key
challenges,
sort of the
yeah.
key challenges of the research team in trying to implement these methods
Yeah, I
and
think
how
the
they were able
two,
to overcome.
yeah, the two challenges I would say is one is a more academic challenge, which is to conceptually frame and put an umbrella theorizing lens to study a very diverse and distinct set of perspectives that you get often, and to make a story of the individual to connect with a larger narrative sometimes is a challenge that one has to make, or is a conscious choice that you have to make between the visual medium, because the visual medium is very clear. If you look at documentary style of filmmaking or using documentaries, it's very clear on what is your immediate line of object, right? And everything is driven through storytelling through that individual or the line of object. So if I'm documenting the way in which how paper mache craft is produced in Kashmir, the entire life cycle of the process of documenting the craft, which you would get in a visual medium, becomes the way people understand how that craft is produced, right? It may be true that paper mache in Kashmir is produced in a certain way, while in Rajasthan, in another state, it is produced in a completely different way. But at that point of time, when I'm sort of documenting this, I'm clearly focusing on what is happening with paper mache and its nature of craft in Kashmir itself. So I think the focal point of your research a lot of times shifts its vantage point, the way you see things. Do you tend to look at things from a more granular, microcosmic way, and you make the study about that alone? Versus, are you asking a set of questions from it, which can connect to a wider debate around what the literature suggests, which is generally what we want to do in an academic or critical reflecting exercise. So I think that has taken, I think, a little more time. We have been able to, maybe I would say, separate certain cases which we find that may not fit well in a larger dialogue of the critical nature of the field of work we are doing, whether in urban informality or let's say the embedded economies project, which look at the intersection of culture, crafts, and the role of women, for example, in the work that happened in handicrafts across villages in India. So those nature of projects, depending on the spectrum of the work we are looking at, we have distinguished between what are anecdotal case studies, which are documented more through the visual form, versus those that we are connecting in long form studies that have a larger academic meaning. There is a wider set of literature you can relate to, and you have more observations that you can connect with, let's say, things that have already been written about. Uh, I do feel that the future context of the kind of work that is happening right now may direct us towards using visual tools to be given to the communities we are studying, as in the community that might be in focus, and allow them to document what in autoethnographic sense is their own lived experience. We didn't do that with any of our visual work actually up until now, but going forward we may want a particular group to maybe use a camera, and just what a lot of photojournalists do is to document their own sort of daily life because of issues that they consider important to their own self. And I think that's where the future line of some of our work would be directed. But I don't know if that would be put in a bracketed sense of a challenge, but I would probably say connecting very independent, distinct narratives within a larger exercise of a research question that is critically reflective of a body of work already produced sometimes become in an observatory sense a challenge for an academic like me, because a lot of our work also happened with students. So it's also interesting to mention that students have in many cases, a non-disciplinary perspective of looking and interpreting things, which is very fresh, organic, and original. We benefited enormously from that exercise in creating this book, because a lot of times there is reflexivity, our own challenge. I mentioned about this in the talk, that you need your own biases to be confronted with. And I think the presence of students a lot of times helped in us looking and perceiving things from our own lens. But at the same time, I think when you're trying to do credible work which resonates with a scholar based in Brazil, let's say working on issues around urban informality, or someone based in South Africa doing similar work with street vendors, there has to be certain common threads that you should be able to speak in that language. And I think that's a big challenge for generally ethnographic work as well, when you look at that.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure there are a lot of people in the WICID community who are going to be really interested to hear this talk, and we look forward to speaking with you again. And do let us know when your book is out, and we can share the news with the readers of our newsletter as well.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good to see you again.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.